Hello Royal Musical Association, I'm Dr. Scott McLaughlin from the University of Leeds, and I'll be presenting and facilitating this composition workshop, which is based on the Garden of Forking Paths project, an AHRC funded leadership fellowship, working with Heather Roche, clarinettist, who you'll see later, and some students from the Royal Northern College of Music, University of Leeds, with thanks as well to Larry Goves and Sarah Watts of the Royal Northern College for their help. For the project, I'm going to talk a little bit about that first, what the project is, what the project is trying to do. It's going to be about 20 minutes, and then we'll spend the hour after that looking at the specific pieces, working through them with Heather and the composers in an asynchronous workshop. The project itself, the Garden of Forking Paths, is a compositional project engaging with the indeterminacy of the clarinet. This means looking at open forms, recursive forms, where different possible paths reveal themselves in performance. It means moving the site of composition from specific controlled objects, such as notes, gestures, specific timbres, etc., towards sonic behaviors of the instrument itself, emergent sonic topologies. It also means treating the player and the instrument as a single assemblage that works together in co-productive performance. This also means treating the player and the instrument as a single assemblage that works together in co-productive performance, with the implication that the clarinet can have its own material agency commensurate with that of the player. That is, composing the piece in such a way that the player follows the materiality of the instrument, to allow the possible paths to be dictated by the instrument's response in the moment. So what's the project trying to do? A key part of this is treating the clarinet as an ongoing instrument, as an agent of ongoingness, not just in terms of continuous sound, but as situatedness, the composed situation that engages with the ongoing mutual feedback of player and instrument, the physical materiality of the instrument itself. This means investigating the clarinet and clarinettists and their performance practice in order to compose for indeterminacy, as valorizing the indeterminate. This isn't simply eliciting unexpected sounds, but it's about repeatedly circling and exploring unstable zones of sound production to see where indeterminacies can lead. The clarinet in this is the garden where paths fork. To compose for this, must engage the player and the composer with the embodied materiality of the player-instrument assemblage. So first I want to talk about this idea of ongoingness. This comes from Donna Haraway, particularly from her book Staying with the Trouble, where she talks of it as being contingent, situated, relational. She describes this as sympoietic, not autopoietic. Its contact zones, she says, are ubiquitous and continuously spin out loopy tendrils. For Haraway, she's talking about the social, she's talking about making kin with the natural world, about working with nature, not as separate culture natures. As Eduardo Cohn summarizes her book, it's about learning to be truly present in order to become capable of a response. So this project is partially resituating that into the idea of playing the clarinet, the ongoingness between the player and the instrument, treating them as an ecological unit working together, which means not purely controlling the instrument. It means taking the skills of the player in working with the instrument into, as Tim Ingold says, truly working with the instrument. So this involves thinking a lot about materiality. And by materiality, I mean the material nature of the instrument itself, as a way of understanding its affordances, its forces and slippages, its preferences and constraints. Most importantly, not as a generalization of physics or the physicality, but in the specific hexaity of that performative moment. What resonances are present now? What lines of flight can emerge from listening and awareness? A convenient way of thinking about this is to use Andrew Pickering's concept of material agency, which is a way of thinking about the clarinet and the player as two agents working together, creating a distance of sorts to avoid collapsing into a purely anthropocentric view of performance. This is a rhetorical gambit in some ways to decenter composition and think from the assemblage. Think of the clarinet and the player working as two independent but joined things that have powers that arise through their working together, through their, as Karen Barrett would say, their intra-action, that agency emerges from the intra-action of these two things. So material of sound for me, not thinking in terms of material as compositional material of notes, etc., but thinking of the materialness of sound is primarily for me about pitch. It's about pitch and timbre continuum, how what we perceive can move between pitch and timbre, how pitches can be emergent, how and when do pitch percepts move from being timbres to specific pitches. And this is essentially to do with resonance, the physical resonance of the instrument. So this is where the project starts, this is where the project situates itself, looking at the resonance of the instrument, looking at the techniques that clarinetists have for working with that resonance, and treating the whole instrument as a resonant topology, and knowing that any given space of the instrument allows different lines of flight, different resonances to emerge, resonances to be sought out, resonances to reveal themselves, and how one can compose for that set of situations, for that situatedness. So a simple example of thinking about these resonances would be to take a glass. A simple drinking glass, when you flick it, the energy most efficiently dissipates at that particular frequency, that ping, because that's the path of least resistance for the dissipative system. You could say the same thing about a piano string or a guitar string. When they're struck, they have a specific pitch at which they're vibrating alongside their harmonics. And the player can alter this to certain extents by plucking it in different places, changing the force and nature and angle of the pluck. Sometimes it's possible to get quite different sounds out of the string by emphasizing different formants, by bringing out different harmonics, etc. But ultimately, striking that string brings out that primary resonance. Fundamentally, the E string of the guitar, what wants to come out is the E in different colors. So the string has a preference, thus an agency of sorts. When energy is put into the thing, relatively neutrally, that is, without overtly trying to alter these preferences, it expresses those preferences sonically, and the resonance comes out. But that resonance is simply the strongest resonance. There are often many other possible paths that resonance can take, and the question is about techniques to access those, and then once those are revealed, what can be done with them. So the reason I talk about those instruments, guitars, pianos, the glass, etc., is that these are essentially event model instruments, in the most case, in how they're mostly used. And this is the model that we, as composers here, have mostly grown up with, especially notationally. While many people have found other ways to think about this, fundamentally, our musical system is built on discrete events at different scales. This glass, when I ping it, is a note. We work with note objects and timbre objects. We move them around, we concatenate them, we sequence them, we verticalize them, etc. But we work with these objects. Another way of thinking about instruments, and this is in no way to obviate the event model, but the model that I prefer for thinking about in this is to focus on their ongoingness against discrete events, to focus on the continuity of sound. This can mean bowed instruments, blown instruments, anything where there's a constant feedback loop between the player and the instrument in the ongoing sound. Not the direct cause and effect of a struck sound, but the enmeshed and continuous balancing of forces across an assemblage of player and instrument. As an example here, I'm going to show a little bit of research I did 5 or 6 years ago by exciting cymbals using a sine wave at a resonant frequency of the cymbal. What's happening here is that we're electronically feeding this sine wave into the cymbal and amplifying it to see how the cymbal reacts to stronger and stronger resonant frequencies. It shows one way that the continuous sound interacts with the material of the cymbal and how the material of the cymbal alters, and that the same physical configuration of instrument can reveal different paths, different states. In this case, simply increasing the energy of the input sine wave means we move through several different states. There's a sine wave with some harmonics. There's a multiphonic state where you can hear multiple discrete pitches, but also blending into a single pitch timbre complex. And with enough energy, it moves into a state of chaotic vibration, which is essentially colored noise. And as I scale back the amplitude again, we return to a multiphonic state, although a different one than we had a minute ago. Because this is a hysteretic system, the way that we move through it, history affects what comes out. It's not simply moving from A to B, but in the process of going from A to B and back again, the direction, the energy, the timing of that means that we can sometimes end up in places that we didn't come through in the first place. Again, multiple paths are revealed as we move through this. This is a bifurcatory system. There are bifurcations in how this moves forward and back. Small changes to how we play can alter the path of energy through the instrument, leading to different outcomes. Sometimes this can be controlled, but this project is specifically interested in the more indeterminate possibilities, in how we can move across pathways, in how pathways split and what the possibilities are, and in working with those indeterminacies as they're revealed specifically in performance. A clarinet, of course, is not the same as a cymbal. It's not as straightforward as simply altering the input energy, because there's a lot of other variables, especially in the throat and embouchure of the player. But the same forking of paths can be seen when performance includes these less stable states of the instrument. And I should say as well that this project is not so much about parameterization of the instrument. It's more akin to the cybernetic black box model, that there is an input and an output, and we can infer things from the input and output, but that there is also a certain amount of unknowingness in the performative ontology. So thinking about ongoingness in the clarinet means thinking about the clarinet as a continuous sound instrument, and also as about an assemblage of player and instrument, a feedback loop. This doesn't have to mean, in terms of continuous sound, circular breathing. This can all be done within a single clarinet note, which can be held easily for 10, 20, even 30 seconds. It's also less about movement between objects, less about moving from C to C sharp, or from multiphonic X to multiphonic Y, and more about the movement between states and behaviors and what happens in that movement, what happens as part of that. And pitches become emergent properties here, emergent properties of perception, whose salience characteristics can be either local or global drivers of the composition. For example, the composition could aim for more focused sense of pitch here, more diffuse sense of pitch there. These can be things that structure a composition as they emerge. There's a continuous negotiation here between player and instrument, which is of course the norm when there is a human player and a material instrument. But here the negotiation itself is valorized more, not as something that's assumed de facto to happen in the process and beforehand, but something that's focused on as an active and engaged thing where there can be a back and forth. Andrew Pickering describes this really nicely as a dance of human and material agencies, the constant push and pull between accommodation and negotiation in an open-ended modeling process where you're constantly modeling a situation, negotiating and accommodating to the material accommodating to the human, etc. So continuous sound is closer in some ways to the model of electronic music, such as the spectral morphology of Dennis Smalley, in that sound is continuously transformed. With acoustic instruments, that possibility for transformation is an affordance of the player-instrument assemblage, part of the physical constraints set up by both those things and the constraints of performance practice. In J.J. Gibson's words, an affordance cuts across the dichotomy of subjective and objective and helps us to understand its inadequacy. It is equally a fact of the environment and a fact of behavior. It is both physical and psychical, yet neither. An affordance points both ways, to the environment and to the observer. Gibson's observation has a co-productive aspect to it that suits this project and points again at Haraway's ideas of ongoingness, mutual support, and to Pickering's dance of agency. The affordance model means thinking of the clarinet in ecological terms, both as an environment that is traversed and engaged by the player, but not neutral or passive. The instrument is an active agent with its own predilections. To channel the ideas of anthropologist Tim Ingold in his writings on being alive and other things, I like to use the analogy of walking to think about this, with the clarinet as a landscape that we move through, Not one landscape, of course, but multiple, sometimes superimposed landscapes. Each time you move a finger on the clarinet, opening a hole, closing a hole, you alter the resonant landscape. Sometimes gently shifting from one forest path to another, sometimes radically morphing from a valley to a steep peak. Every different fingering of the clarinet is like a different section of landscape. Each offers various paths to traverse it. Some fingerings are like a mountain pass, with a single safe path the only way out, and many more precarious routes that lead to uncertain places. Most fingerings offer several possible paths to different places, different points on the same harmonic series perhaps, usually requiring different ways of walking, different techniques to traverse the different types of ground. The player can make choices about which path they prefer, or sometimes the landscape decides for them, limiting their routes or sending them tumbling from a slippery bank onto a well-worn path. The point is that the environment has agency, and player and environment work together in a dance of agency. As a composer, I get to plan the terrain, but I plan it knowing that how the player gets across that terrain will be decided through performance, and those decisions can lead to multiple different paths which unfold in performance. Another key point about this analogy is that it also works across time. The more that a player traverses different landscapes, then the more they develop the techniques to adapt to that variability. Listening, awareness, and responsiveness are all key skills, sharpened by the repeated doing and experiencing of contingency. One output of the Garden of Fork and Path project will be sets of studies, musical studies, etudes on situatedness, which focus the skills of listening to the instrument, skills of awareness of resonances and the pathways they offer, and responsiveness to the instrument's agency. Instruments, of course, are not neutral landscapes. To traverse the instrument, the player develops techniques of the body to adapt to the different terrains. On the clarinet, this includes finger movement and finger placement techniques. But this project is focused less on finger movement and more on the mouth, the throat, the embouchure. The Garden of Fork and Paths focuses on the multiple and overlapping techniques used from the embouchure contact with the instrument through the mouth shape and tongue position into the vocal cavity, throat tuning, air support, and diaphragm pressure, and the way that all of these interlock. When I refer to techniques of the body, embodied techniques, this is what I mean. And it's worth flagging at this point as well that this isn't a question of parametrizing those things. Well, some composers have found very fruitful engagement with parametrizing and decoupling physical aspects of instrument playing. This project instead is treating all of these interlocked mechanisms as more of a cybernetic system, something where you have inputs, you have outputs, but there's a black box between, which is sufficiently complex that the best way to deal with it is to take it phenomenologically, treat the phenomena, look to the phenomena as something that can be worked with. So phenomena here equates to behaviors, the sonic behaviors of the instruments, the sonic phenomena that the player is working with. On the clarinet, techniques of the body vary across and within the three different registers of the instrument, to the extent that the clarinet can also be considered as three different superimposed instruments. The chalumeau, the lowest register of the instrument, the clarineau, which is the second register overblown from the first with the register key, and the altissimo register. These three registers, chalumeau, clarineau, and altissimo, are a key way of thinking about this. And within these registers, techniques can also vary depending on the tube length. The technique required to play the full tube E3, the full 17 inches of clarinet, is slightly different from playing the high A sharp 4 at the other end of that, where only 6 or 7 inches of air is vibrating in the tube. Of course, for clarinettists, these techniques are completely internalized, what Ben Spatz refers to as sedimented technique. And this sedimented technique is something that, again, in using indeterminacy, in valorizing indeterminacy, what we don't want to do is throw away these sedimented techniques. The question is more a repurposing and revalorizing of those into supporting the indeterminacy. For wind instrument players especially, the key to adopting the correct technique in a given situation is knowing what you're aiming for. Thus, while the same fingering can be used to produce several different pitches across different registers, players use the relevant embodied technique to filter that tube's resonances to achieve what they want. So the same G3 tube, all fingers down, can be used to play that G3, it can be overblown to D5 or to the B above that, etc. So they can use those different embodied techniques when the notation tells them what they're aiming for. It's a little bit different than when we're dealing with an indeterminacy, when you're not specifically telling the player aim for this pitch or that pitch, or that it's slightly fuzzier. So what we have in this situation, when I talk about indeterminacy, it can be read as meaning anything goes, where indeterminate sound simply means whatever comes out is correct. And this is something that has been used very fruitfully, again, by other composers, but this project eschews that particular solution. Instead, this project takes contingent sounds as specific, significant, and consequential once they have been revealed in performance, but not specifying them in advance. So pitches, sounds, etc. are emergent. That is, that when a given fingering is used and there's the possibility of, who knows, a B4 and a C#5 emerging from it, the score doesn't specify which one is to be aimed for. What the score says, though, is once one of them does emerge, that is now in place. That is a thing that has happened and has to be responded to, has to be kept into the ongoingness of the piece. And how this is achieved is using repetition in the scores. So the scores use repetition to increase engagement with the materiality of the instrument itself. So an indeterminate sound is played several times to explore its different indeterminacies, to critique the terrain and develop a feel for its contingencies and the forking paths that they reveal. This is a very important part of the project, treating repetition as a way of taking a juncture, a forking path, not just as something that happens and we move on from it, but something that we keep examining over and over again to start to get a feel for the stochastics of that particular node. What happens at this point in the piece, that there are multiple possible ways out of this, and that they often recurse back on each other, revealing the different paths that are possible. Such exploratory playing poses challenges, of course, to sedimented agency and the natural, I should say, developed skills of the player. And it requires strong skills of the player for awareness and responsiveness when they don't know going in what the specific goal is going to be. So it requires them to adapt the embodied techniques to a more fuzzy form of playing. A simple relevant example here would be the playing of stable multiphonics, which for a beginner player who's never done this before is quite challenging to achieve the right balance of embouchure and breath pressure. It's, to go back to the spatial analogy, it's akin to walking off well-worn paths, well-understood paths for the first time to find your way. But as players continue this, they get a feel for the range of techniques required and a feel for the performative adjustments that can be made. And some very good research on this is Jack Liang's DMA thesis, where he uses ultrasound to map the different tongue positions used in multiphonics, concluding that there's essentially 4 different positions which are varied for individual players in multiphonics. But with more exploratory playing like this project is looking for, this comes a commitment to ongoingness, not just in finding that correct position, but in understanding the paths that flow in and out of that position and how they might lead onwards. It's not simply a matter of knowing how to stabilize the multiphonic, it's knowing what happens on the way towards it, where the possible forks might lie there, or what a sense of forkiness in and out of that could be in that context. So this isn't about an exhaustive mapping. This isn't a project to positivistically reduce the clarinet to a bunch of pitch possibilities. Instead, it's an understanding of the flows and energies that allow the player to follow the vital materialities that emerge in performance. So where does all this get us? In thinking about the material agency of the clarinet, there's an exploratory opportunity, and composing for this involves compositional strategies that valorize exploration in performance. This is composing less as sequencing specifics and more about what Thomas DeLeo describes as circumscribing openness. This is composing situatedness in ways that constrain some types of terrain and open up others, that bake in awareness and responsiveness into the score, that present many paths and give players the tools to make choices about those paths, or even to let the instrument lead in choosing which paths. So long term, this project will produce outputs along a continuum of softer and harder approaches, compositional outputs mostly, where the soft end of this is more traditional types of scores where indeterminacy, where it's used, is more limited or constrained, possibly to reproducible indeterminacies or quite specific forkings, or perhaps even working out what a specific fingering affords and instrumentalizing that topology into a limited set of paths. Most of the pieces so far have tended to try to avoid specifying pitches or specific fingerings, working more instead with abstractions. With the harder end of the project outputs, then it becomes more about valorizing that exploratory feeling out of the instrument in real time, exploring the resonance topology in relation to an open score. Arguably, the vanishing point of the project would be at the stage where it's simply a free improvisation of the player with the instrument, responding to the instrument in real time, something like Joris Rule or other improvising clarinetists might do. The project itself, I think, ends just before that, where there is still a purpose and a use in having a score that defines and constrains in some way the way that the player works with the instrument. So that concludes the overview and the context. For the rest of this session, I'm just going to talk a little bit more about the technique insights that were developed so far for the project. Then myself and Heather will workshop the pieces along with the composers. And all of these pieces have been produced in response to two technique videos that we've done so far. And these look respectively at clarinet registers and resonance and clarinet loading and venting. There's links here for those videos if you want to go and check them out. They're about 10 or 15 minutes long each. But first I'll just walk through what these videos cover as a way of leading into the composition workshop. I should caveat all of this by pointing out that very little in these techniques will be new to clarinettists per se, but it may provide different ways of thinking about techniques for clarinetists because it approaches the instrument not from a perspective of this is how you play an A, this is how you play a C sharp. It approaches it from the perspective of this is the physics of how the instrument works and these are the possibilities within this particular resonance tube, etc., or these are possible techniques. So it might provide a useful other way of thinking about the instrument. The videos really are more aimed at composers, demystifying the instrument, allowing them to think more about what the possibilities are. So to describe the two videos, the first one, clarinet register and resonance, looks at the three different registers of the instrument, the shallow, the clarinet, and the altissimo, in terms of their strong resonances. That is, for example, the fingering for E3. E3 is its strong resonance. Almost anything you do to the instrument in that fingering configuration is going to produce an E3. There are other things that can happen, but that's a particularly strong resonance. So it looks at these common traditional fingerings, but explores what other things are possible and how they can be reached. So, for example, techniques of overblowing and underblowing, different forms of multiphonics that can be found bridging and working across those registers. A key starting point for the project is to take fingerings as the starting material, the physical configuration of the instrument, the multiple different possible ways that it can be configured. That's the starting point, and then combine that with the embodied techniques of the performer to traverse these registers in different ways or connect these registers. So it treats pitch really as an emergent property of fingerings, and some fingerings are more diffuse in their emergent pitch properties than others. Rhythm is not a particularly strong concern of the project. I'll leave that up to somebody else. This first video looks at basic fingerings that are mostly used for one or two specific pitches, but expands out to the variety that can be got from those once you stop thinking about the particular abstractions of pitch, etc. The second video is concerned with the concepts of loading and venting, which I borrowed from the saxophonist Thomas Bergeron in his work. This looks at what happens when fingerings are altered by either loading them, which is to add closed holes downstream from the lowest open hole of the instrument, and this tends to have a flattening effect on pitch and also alters the timbre significantly and can make it more unstable. And then also venting, which is the opposite. It's taking a fingering and opening holes further upstream from it, which is essentially like loading in reverse. However, it also has the effect of providing acting as register keys. So as well as flattening the pitch within a register, it can allow for leaping of registers, and also it's also a way of looking at how multiphonics form. You can take a look at a single or double or triple vented fingering and see how the upper and middle and lower pitches relate to the fingering structures and the various positions of the holes in a vague way, not exactly. Multiphonics will be the theme of the third video, which will be out in a couple of months' time. So before we look at the pieces, just to summarize the technical approach of the project, it treats clarinet fingerings as topologies that can be accessed by the clarinettists using different embodied techniques to reveal a variety of pitch structures, which may be focused or diffuse, single or multiple, and have different levels of instability or indeterminacy. As a side note, I personally have less interest in the specificity of pitches revealed. This isn't a project to map out the cent values of pitches of every possible fingering. The project instead assumes a unique vitality of each player instrument assemblage to produce unique responses to each situated performance. Ongoingness is the goal here. This is about thinking in terms of continua, the possibilities that emerge from the assemblage of that particular fingering on that particular instrument with that particular player in the moment of performance. But going into that particularity, that situation, knowing the likely paths and tendencies of the given configuration of the instrument. So there are tendencies, there are overarching global likelihoods, but the individual performance can reveal different paths that may not have been knowable in advance. It's also important to note that the focus on the instrument here shouldn't be taken to undermine the agency of the player. The player is key in the dance of agency. Both things must work symbiotically. They must work in tandem. And of course, it's well known among wind players and composers that the performer has a lot of ability to influence the instrument. The same instrument passed between 2 or 3 players will sound like those players more than it will sound like itself. The emphasis on the instrument is partially a rhetorical device to think from the materiality of the instrument rather than abstractions like pitch systems, etc. Also, this statement shouldn't be taken to be in conflict with the idea that some of the compositional strategies ask the player to step back from controlling the specific output of the instrument. As much as the player is in control of the instrument, they can also pull back and move their skills from controlling the instrument into a support of what the instrument is doing. That awareness of resonances, that listening to the possible lines of flight out of the current resonance, where it might resolve or collapse to. This is taking the same skill but inverting it in terms of function. I hope you enjoy the pieces.
So I think Ed's piece does a really good job of sort of playing with these kind of liminal places. So he's always asking for this continuous movement between an open tone hole and then a half hole and a closed tone hole, and I think that works really well. The one thing he doesn't explain, I don't think that well in the performance notes, is what the sort of graphic notation underneath the multiphonics means. I sort of assume that that has to do with embouchure position. But I wonder if there's sort of, if there might be a better way to do that, given that even when I'm trying to find the places between, say I have at most kind of 4 different embouchure positions that I'm using to get these different multiphonics. And by different multiphonics, I mean different pitch results for each multiphonic. There might be a better way, because he's sort of got these kind of very squiggly lines, and that doesn't really line up with the process that I'm executing. So something that's actually more akin to what he does with these half holings. So you have like embouchure position, half hole, half hole, but then it's not, of course, not a hole, but just to try to emphasize the liminal spaces rather than this just sort of squiggly line, which sometimes I think really does work. So for example, after the 4th multiphonic, I've got this sort of 7-second break, and we've immediately got this jump up and a leap back downwards. So I try to kind of introduce that into the music, and I think that works really well. Because it sort of asks me to do an almost kind of glissando type thing. Trying to think of what else to say about this. It's quite tricky to make these half holdings really smooth and to last basically throughout the whole sort of 10 seconds or 15 seconds or whatever. But I think it's a good exercise. It's not something clarinet players have to do that often. And I mean, as I said already, it's very effective. Yeah, and I think trying to keep the dynamics as low as possible. Obviously, this PPP doesn't work perfectly, because we've got these multiple pitches, and some of them are so high that it's definitely like louder than that in sort of objective terms. But I think the instruction works really well for the clarinetists, because it kind of forces us to sort of really kind of pinch and really try to make that happen, and that adds, I think, to the overall effect. So yeah, good job, Ed. I think this also captures the spirit of the project really well for me and Scott, so he might have some more to say about that.
Great. Thanks, Ed, for the piece, and Heather, thank you for the playing and the commentary. I have a couple of follow-up things on that. I think the half-hole thing is really interesting, both because of the smooth transitioning and because of its interaction with that other graphic notation, which I agree is tricky and problematic to try and connect those. Regarding the half holes, Heather, could you go back and do another example where we can see your fingers maybe? I realize that half holing is a tiny, tiny movement, but it might be instructive just to see how small the movement is. It's really interesting from a project point of view, this piece, because something that we examine in the second video is the way that the physics of holes in the clarinet, the holes that are covered and uncovered, means that can affect what pitches can pass by. So a basic multiphonic thing is when a hole is opened in the middle, it means that you get 2 resonating tubes, because the hole stops low frequencies from passing. So a tube that was 6 fingers down, if you lift up that finger, the hole opens up and you get the low frequency stops at that point of the tube, but high frequencies don't get pulled out of the smaller hole, so the high frequencies are coming from lower down the tube. My point being that as you open and close that half hole, even the tiny changes in aperture are going to affect the frequency of which pitches or which harmonics or which partials of that sound are going to pass by or are going to emerge. So as you're altering that, there's a kind of lumpiness as you're slowly shifting on and off the key, which is going to allow for an indeterminacy of which harmonics of the lowest depressed key or the lowest closed hole is going to come out, which is really interesting. It's a space, and of course that also then aligns with embouchure position, whether or not you're aiming for higher pitches or lower pitches. There's going to be an alignment between what the configuration of the instrument wants to let out and what your embouchure is going to emphasize. And if they line up at the right moment, then something can really pop out, or they might always be in tension with each other, etc. So the graphic notation could certainly be taken as something that directs the player more towards that.
So for the half-holing stuff, I'm just going to tilt my camera down a little bit. Hopefully that works so that you can see sort of what I'm doing. And I'm going to stand up. So I just want to show a little bit of what happens when I'm doing this half-holing. So part of the issue is that this has to come down. So I'm kind of doing two half-holes at the same time, trying not to just slam the ring down at the same time, because we sort of hear that because that closes this pad here, and while also doing the actual half-holing. So what I'll do is I'll do the first one, and I'm going to start on that high note, and I'm not going to change my embouchure so that you sort of get an idea of what happens there. So that first bit, just closing this bit, that actually, I think that's the glissando that Scott's been hearing about. That's just this going down, which obviously has a big impact because it's the closest thing to what's happening here. And then maybe I'll find another example that does something a little bit different. So maybe when I get to the third one and then have to start unhalf-holing. Okay. And let's start with a different embouchure position as well. So I do find there's often a position where when I just start the half-holing, I lose the multiphonic just for a second. And I don't know if that's just me not maintaining control, or if it's just what happens. You hear what I mean? It kind of dips down and then slides back in again. And then, so we have all of these different layers, don't we? Because we have the half-holing, and then I'm doing the embouchure stuff at the same time. So I think for the listener, even if you're a clarinetist, it's sort of hard to tell what's going on. So for example, with this first one, so if I'm moving the embouchure and moving my finger at the same time, I mean, I think when you hear these glissandi, it is a little bit difficult to tell whether it's the finger or not. But so hopefully being able to see it a little bit right now has helped to make that clear.
Great, so firstly, thank you so much to Scott for inviting me to be part of this, and also to Heather for the performance. I didn't realise that you could circular breathe, so that's kind of made it a bit more interesting, I guess, not quite what I expected. And also I'm glad that you think it sort of takes the essence of the project, because I had wondered if I'd sort of slightly aim to undermine all these channels of stability that you can kind of find by just saying, let's not do that and let's do the opposite. So the graphic notation, to be honest with you, I kind of just did that on a bit of a whim, and I think sometimes when I'm composing I quite like to kind of visualise the sounds or even like actions that I'm trying to specify. So I'm kind of really glad that you think it might be able to be used for embouchure position. I'd kind of just thrown it in because I suppose that's kind of the way that I was thinking about the sound, kind of like mixing and kind of having these sort of vague shapes that come together but then kind of quickly dissipate into things that are much bigger. The half-holing stuff, yeah, I'm kind of glad that that's a bit difficult and something that you're not asked to do as a clarinetist very often. I wonder if I could just be a bit more specific with it, to be honest with you. I suppose I hadn't really appreciated the key that's attached to the right hand, so that would have to come down, and then you kind of get that slight bump, and how that might affect stuff, as in if you're coming into that from nothing or not. I think it's quite nice. I think maybe this does kind of undermine other parts of the project, but this, Scott kind of mentioned this sense of like, if you get a multiphonic that starts to pop out, then kind of there might be the possibility to follow that avenue. And actually I kind of think it's nicer to kind of like just bypass that and have that as a kind of consequence of an action. And yeah, I suppose the dynamics are kind of like willfully unplayable. I mean, it's ridiculously quiet, but I'm glad that you think it works well to kind of like remind the performer to, I don't know, be kind of constantly readjusting and have that kind of tension. I think hopefully that works quite well. So yeah, thanks very much for including me.
Right, just quickly, I think with a lot of these, my sort of response videos, it's a kind of series of aha moments, just as people sort of clarify things and it all makes a lot more sense, that you would use these lines to kind of just visualize the material, and that it sort of happened on a whim. That makes a lot of sense, and for a workshop that makes even more sense. I guess I would just say that like a conscientious performer will take whatever information they can and find some way to kind of work with that, and that just seemed to me to make the most sense to sort of use that as a kind of embouchure thing. I think with the half holing and with any kind of like embouchure stuff, I think you could totally be more specific with it. If you think about kind of the speed, like trying to do them really slowly did bring out some things, but then of course trying to do them more quickly might bring out different things. It was not a very specific answer, but so you sort of get the idea. So it's a little bit difficult to talk about things being sort of right or wrong, especially when we're talking about a graphic score, because obviously my interpretation has played a big role here. So for example, she's got basically along the bottom line 2 different fundamentals. And when I first started looking at this, I was kind of playing with different fundamentals for that low one, because with each one she's looking at sort of different regions of partials, and I think having the flexibility to be able to change multiphonic gives me a little bit more room to maneuver in. So for example, the very last one, because it's asking for 5 different harmonics and they're spaced in the way that they are, I'll try to explain that better in a second. They're spaced in the way that they are, I really have to use the low C, because that's the only one sorry, I should say six harmonics. That's the only one where I really have this much to work with, and that's just because with the low C, that's the lowest note on the instrument, I've got the whole tube to overblow from, and there really isn't any other multiphonic that will do that. So that one sort of set the other 2 for me. But I could also imagine a different version of this piece where, say, like the ones on the bottom line represent kind of low multiphonics, so sticking in that general area, in which case I might use something like this for the first one. Which is a much nicer trill than what I did before. Although again, that low C is much more kind of brutal in the effect when I do it trill and the multiphonics. And then I mean, I have a lot of like basically questions about what happens in the middle where we've got quite high fundamental and then overblowing. That sort of makes sense. So I was doing something like, I mean, more or less almost impossible to kind of flutter tongue and get that harmonic to come out, but maybe that's nice. There's a kind of nice effect in the difficulty there. And then we have a fundamental on top that we're underblowing from, and I think I stayed in the same area. And then kind of dropped back down to what I'm using is a low A for that second line of fundamentals. So basically, by using a fingering for a high C sharp, which is basically, I can't really show you on the whole screen, but it's basically the same as the fingering for the low A, just with the register key and with this little guy shifted over, so that's open. Then I can kind of play with basically blending some of these different things, because that's the other thing that the score doesn't necessarily make clear, which is kind of the duration. So all of the harmonics are the same kind of shape. I mean, it for my money it works really well because there's a lot to talk about and a lot of kind of room to play with, and I guess I'd just be curious to know sort of if Megan is thinking about these kind of specifics, or if she's even interested in that, or if it's just sort of like if her work is just kind of creating a sort of opportunity, basically. And anyway, I really like the image, which I guess is the Barbican. Oh yeah, and I really like also the difference between how the dynamics are done. So the dynamics are related to the shading on the image, although sometimes it's hard to work out if something is shaded in a kind of gray or if it's black, just because the partials and the fundamentals tend to cover what's underneath. So maybe those could be somehow more opaque, or there could be some other way to do that. I'm not sure. And it would be great if there was just more like variation, I guess, in that, or more visible variation. I almost wondered if the last one, when you have these harmonics going up, if that gray is actually getting darker as we go up the building, in which case there should be some sort of crescendo there, but it's so difficult to see. Like maybe actually supplying a copy of the image of the building by itself as part of the score, just to give you an idea of what's there. Maybe that's useful.
Thanks, Megan, for your piece. That's really interesting, and there's always a lot of fun things to talk about with graphic scores like this, especially where, as Heather says, her interpretation comes into play. But I'm interested to see what kind of things you wanted to happen with this, other than for Heather to make an interpretation of it. What I think works really nicely is that, as well as you having these low fundamentals with harmonics moving around, which is a fairly straightforward thing for bass clarinet to do, you've also got these ones in the middle particularly fascinate me. So that one the two that are at position 3, the third event in the score, where you have that high flutter-tongued fundamental and then that even higher underblown fundamental. And here I'm taking fundamental to mean primary resonance, something that we talked about in the first video of the project, that strong resonance, as Heather says, that high C sharp that she plays for the second one, which is underblown. So it's that variance of technique there is interesting. You have these overblown partials that are being moved through from the low fundamental, and you have these higher clarinet and altissimo pitches that are then being under or overblown in more subtle ways. One thing I thought about the very final gesture, where Heather drops back down to the low C and plays all those harmonics, because it's ranged quite high, but it looks to me like it's intended as a simultaneity. But of course, to do that actually, I'm not sure if it is possible to do that in one go. I guess you could get a very brutally overblown multiphonic that would give you lots of partials, but you'd lose the specificity of having them. I guess that's something we could ask Heather to see if she can do something like that. The other thing always to query with scores like this is where there appear to be relationships that are drawn, because of course something like this has to be taken relativistically, in that does it have to be that the first high partial on the left is the same pitch as when you move rightwards across the score, where it appears again just above number 2 with the third partial going up? Are they supposed to be the same pitch? Should they be taken as the same pitch, or is it more the gesture of 3 things rising that's important? Similarly, Heather's moving between 2 low fundamentals, number 1 and 2, and then across halfway from 2, 3, and 4, that higher fundamental that she's using. It's easy to keep those as being the same because it's just easier to finger them that way, because they are relatively controlled as fingerings. But when you get to the end, it seems to imply that the event at beat 5, should consist of the same original fundamental and also whatever was the higher fundamental now as a second partial or higher partial of that. So I guess what I'm saying is it's not always clear which relationships are to be respected and which can be bent. And I guess that's maybe the point. Maybe the point is that the player has an openness to decide which things should be.
Thank you so much, Heather, for recording this. That was really wonderful. I should talk a bit about the notation and why I chose it. I've actually done a set of string orchestra pieces in the past that are called Conversations with Style and Do, that use an acetate overlay onto architectural photography with the pictures and graphics on, so you can see right through to the photo of the building much more clearly. And this was just a kind of different alternative way of trying it out without using plastic and without having to post anything to you guys during lockdown. That was really it. But I'm really glad that you raised that point about not being able to see the shading fully, because I think the acetate overlays really solve that problem, and they also look really beautiful. It is a found image, I should say. It's not mine, and what I really like about it is that you can pick out whatever detail that you want as a performer. So you might have noticed certain things in the details of the building that I wouldn't have, or that another performer wouldn't have, or you could have just seen the color of it, the shape, and that's what's really great, especially for such a short amount of time as a miniature. You're always going to kind of pick out something different each time. I personally prefer chance and indeterminacy as a composer, and putting any kind of linear notation like this on that does kind of somewhat immediately break that. But I'll talk more about that in a second. I want to talk a bit about what you and Scott, what Heather and Scott both kind of touched on, which was the repetition of certain notes at a vertical level and horizontal vertical relativity. And I think that the score can be read either way, either as gestural or determined. That bottom C trill, yes, definitely sounds more brutal, which I think is fantastic. And it's lovely that you picked that out, so that's great. I think what's to be said about that relationship and how the notes have been set out is that it's interesting because the score is the Barbican Centre, and so the image is a cut section, cross section of part of the Barbican Centre, and that building is very paradoxical in its brutalism and squareness, rigidity, structure, and grids. And yet, when you're there, it can be very disorientating, particularly in never really knowing what level you're on, or where you're going, or how to directly get to where you're going. So I think actually it's really interesting to me, as a lover of that slightly frustrating piece of London architecture, that this has represented that in some way, because I would aim for the pictures to be returned to, and then you could be open to where the building and the resultant multiphonics pull you towards when you're playing, and then what does that do to your orientation and your perception of what is that note. I think that's still like incredibly valid point, because the score as it is probably should be changed to reflect that, because I definitely see that reading it at the moment it looks very determined. As an afterthought, if there had been no added notation and simply a text instruction that asked you to read the building as layers of fundamentals and partials, what do you think would change? That was really wonderful. Thank you again, Heather, so much, and Scott as well, for organising this, and your thoughts as well. It was really wonderful to hear.
I just wanted to say about the Barbican, I remember really clearly when I first came to London and went to the Guildhall to study, and I got really into the architecture. There's something sort of irresistible about it, and I don't think I even realised then how kind of special or rare that is in London, and I just got lost a lot. So I think that works really well. That sort of that sense of disorientation. I'm not sure that necessarily comes across in the image. If you didn't know the Barbican, or if you didn't know something about kind of brutalist architecture, you could end up interpreting the thing in a totally different way, which is fine. I also, when I watched your video and you said about the acetate, it was like, obviously, yeah, that's really clear then. So yeah, I just wanted to say well done. Okay, so I think the sonic result of what José's done here is super nice. I mean, it's just the kind of thing that Scott and I have spent a lot of time talking about. The tricky thing about this is the notation. And there are a few kind of issues, but I'm not sure I really have a solution. To me, this is sort of trying to reinvent the wheel a little bit too much. So I've spent most of my time just thinking about what fingers to lift and put back down again. And that doesn't leave a lot of mind space free for thinking about the sonic result or thinking about music. And that sort of ends up being a little bit frustrating. One of the problems is that the black lines show when a key is depressed rather than when something is open or closed. So the register key starts out depressed in the beginning, but that actually means to open it. And I find, for example, and the same thing with the C sharp key and the G sharp key, depressing them actually opens the key rather than closing. So I find this sort of like, it just took me a little bit of time to get my head around, especially when you come to the G sharp key opening, for example, in the first one right at the bottom there, but I'm actually closing that key in order to do that, if that makes sense. Also, just simply the number of lines, and that I can't see just what would be really nice is if you could tell just from looking at where the L1, L2, L3, R1, R2, R3 were, because those would help to kind of basically just act as a good reference point. I mean, I think there's a reason that in music notation we basically have 5 lines and then we use ledger lines so that the 5 lines are always really clear all the time. So one thing you could do is space it out a little bit differently. Another thing you could do, which is sort of what I did in my score, is basically to highlight those 6 lines in a different color just to kind of give my mind something to grab onto. And then having the rhythms so far away from all of these lines, like having the rhythms not integrated with the different fingers coming off and on, is a little bit tricky. I kind of almost wonder if getting rid of all of the lines and just having the rhythms and writing T and then square and then R2 and R, because at most you have 3 fingers moving simultaneously, and then you could just have that underneath and only have the ones that you need when you need them, because there's just I think there's just a bit too much extra information at any given time on the score, and it just makes it really difficult to read. And it's one thing if it's a miniature, it's only sort of 30 seconds long, but if I had to learn a piece that was 10 minutes long using this material, I think there's definitely a way to do this more quickly. I mean, I didn't even do dynamics because there's too many lines. I think rhythm, dynamics, you could even include articulations if you did this, because there's no articulations through this. I just kind of slurred everything, but there's no indication. Now I'm like squinting to make sure you haven't actually written what to do. There's no indication. So if you just had rhythms, dynamics, and then which finger to open when under that rhythm, and then you could do it all with sort of 3 lines for the fingers, 1 line for the rhythm. The rhythms would also include articulations, obviously, and then have dynamics. Because I think also, if you're going to play with the way these multiphonics change really slowly when you open and close different fingers, which I really love, and I love when you get to the end of the line and then you start the next one, and you're like, oh right, that F sharp's there, and we've moved very, very far away from it somehow. But if you're gonna play with that, then I feel like having the space to add articulations would be good. But right now you really don't, because as it is, there's a little bit too much information. I think that's all I have to say about that. I know that Jose, you and Scott already talked a lot about different solutions for this, and I think I saw a handwritten draft at some point, but I don't know. Maybe it would be worth me drawing what I think a solution could look like. Maybe I'll do that.
Thank you, Jose. I'm really enjoying this asynchronous process of workshopping because it gives us a chance to think a little bit longer about some of these things as they're coming up, rather than just always responding exactly in the moment. So the loads of things I really like about this piece, and I won't talk too much about notation because Heather's talked a lot about that, and I think what there is to say about that is that notation in these kind of situations, notation is always just an interesting challenge. There is no correct notation for this. There's just one that works best for this player in this context. Often you'll find that when you depart from standard forms of notation and well tried and tested forms of notation, what works for one player then doesn't work for another player, although I agree with Heather that this is visually problematic in many ways. But again, that's not a criticism, that's a acknowledgement that this is a process. The idea is there, the technical idea is there of what you're trying to achieve. This is one way to get to it, but there are probably more efficient ways to get to it. I have an example of that in a minute. So things I think really work about this. I mean, I'm a big fan of this way of moving through the fingers, but also asking the player to respond a little bit to those as they're going. So she's trying to keep this particular multiphonic in balance, knowing that the change of fingers is going to alter that, and trying to keep that balancing as she goes along. From a point of view of technique, what I like as well is that this is a really good example of what I talked about earlier, about how this lower shallow pitch in the multiphonic is altered by the changes of loading. That each time you're opening a fingering, you're altering, sorry, each time you're lifting one of those fingers that are down, because we begin the piece with all fingers down on a key of some sort or a whole, and each time you're lifting one of those, you're altering what the shortest tube is, and what the basic tube is, and that basic tube is then changing the length of that pitch. So you're beginning with the register key open and the C sharp hole open, and then adding in the thumb key adds a further, or removes a further loading from that, so you have a change in the shallow pitch. But also you're hearing, particularly as right hand keys are being changed, so when you're opening those right two notes, the G sharp key, etc., when those are being altered, you're hearing changes to that F sharp, because it's altering what's happening on the tube that's affected from the clarinet register up on that longer tube, the whole length of the instrument, which is affecting the upper F sharp. So you get this beautiful interplay between these things. The dynamics, as Heather said, in this workshop context, you didn't have a chance really to put those to the test. Dynamics is an interesting notational problem with multiphonics, because quite often the multiphonic will only work, or a certain type of response will only happen at a certain type of dynamic. So it may be that, for example, in the top layer, you've only got pushes and pulls. There's no specific dynamics given, which I think is useful, because then the player can judge what that increase or decrease of dynamic is usefully going to achieve. Where you have specific dynamics, MFs and Ps, I think in this context they have to be taken much more relationally, perhaps to the point of being not that useful. But it depends on what you want. If you want the player to play the dynamics literally and accept whatever happens to the notation, to the sound from that, that's one way of doing it. If you want the change in dynamics to alter the sound along certain lines, maybe not with specific outcomes, but thinking again indeterminately what pathways are opened up when a dynamic is changed in this fingering configuration, then I think a more relational approach can be useful. But again, this is something that probably needs to be outlined to the player beforehand, so that they know what they're doing. They're not just responding in a tablatural sense to exactly what they're seeing and just letting the sound happen as it happens. They're attempting to negotiate between the fingering that they've got and then the instruction to increase dynamic at that point. What does that mean for that fingering in that context? Which I think is really interesting. My approach within this project is to take the latter, to give the player an idea of what kind of things they're trying to do, so that when you introduce that force, that that force has a direction, even if the specific outcome is unknown, that there is a way of knowing what it is that you're trying to do with that force, or what it is you're trying to disrupt or to strengthen. On a similar point, I think the question here of embouchure and registers is quite interesting, because the notation implies that that shallow pitch and that F sharp altissimo pitch you should be attempting to maintain those, that's something that should be taken as a ground, which is then altered by the other things. The interesting question is, how far should the player push that? And that again is where the dynamics come in, because the dynamics are going to alter whether or not either of those pitches will sound, or whatever their altered versions are at that moment. So because you're not explicitly directing the player to do anything with those new fingerings other than allow the fingering change to happen and try and keep the E quarter flat and the F sharp in balance, or whatever they alter to when you change the fingerings, then, well, I guess the player has to make that interpretation about how far to let the change of instrument configuration when you lift a finger, etc., how far to let that change. So it's another negotiation, but it's one that they haven't been given any guidance on. So you could find that different players have very different approaches to that. Alternatively, you could make the score more specific about what you want, but I suspect at this point in the game you're not quite sure what it is that you want. I may be wrong about that, but it might be interesting to think in terms of embouchure, and I don't necessarily mean, and I don't think actually a lot of players would like this, the very specific approach that says use this embouchure, use this embouchure. I think that can maybe be a little bit alienating. Some players may enjoy it. But something that maybe pushes them into one or more registers, and of course I'm saying this with the bias that this is how I solve that problem. I solve it by directing players at one or more registers. But that's not necessarily the only way. So I guess when you hear this, it'd be interesting to see what you think about whether that needs to be directed further or whether it sits well as it is. Also, I have a potential solution to the notational problem. Rather than having so much going on the page, it might be useful to think of it like this. This highlights the rhythms more and makes it clearer in any given beat of the rhythm what the player is trying to do. So it reduces information complexity. The player still has to get used to what is meant by these and the unusual fingering that this requires, but I think that's easier once they can see from beat to beat what it is that they're supposed to be doing. In this case, what I've suggested is that opening crotchet beat is all fingers down, and then the green and reds respectively would be when you're lifting a finger and replacing that finger. So this, I think I've modeled what you do in the first few beats or so in your score here using this. Heather has since suggested that the colors might be swapped because the green intuitively makes more sense the other way around, but yeah, this is the kind of thing that you negotiate individually with the player, which color works best, etc.
Hi Heather, hi Scott, thank you so much for this workshop opportunity and thank you for your really insightful comments. I guess there's no other way for me to start this response rather than with notation. Notation has been by far the most problematic and challenging aspect of the shaping of this miniature. Most of my conversations with Scott since submitting my first draft for the piece, this handwritten draft, have been focused on trying to find more effective notational systems for the piece. The initial inspiration for this kind of notational system comes from David Pockney's Grey Winter Grimes, which is a miniature written for Catherine Williams, in which the notation breaks down what every single finger involved in playing the flute does. And I found that this sort of system responded quite well to the way I was thinking through the composition of the piece. Well, I was reluctant to use fingering diagrams for every new change of fingering because I didn't want these to be understood as new things or new blocks of sound, but rather as progressions and variations from the initial multiphonic. looking at it now, maybe a system that uses both diagrams, also arrows and lines, potentially colors, could make things easier, especially I feel would make things more intuitive with regards to the use of the register key, the G sharp and C sharp keys. As well, the familiarity with the use of diagrams would make this confusion between pressing a key, opening a hole, and vice versa. It would make things easier, I think. And indeed, the use of colors to give the players some reference point in the score would make things really easier. That's a really good suggestion. I went through some attempts in order to condense the score, but while I was doing this, I did keep the lines because I felt it was important, to show the connection and the trajectory of each finger, either from open to close or from close to open. I tried them both, and I feel it was important to show this in order for the player to know at every point where they should be. But doing this, the score quickly got quite messy, especially by the end of the first line, in which there are 5 changes happening at the same time. So seeing now that the lines are not as vital as I thought they were at the start, then it could be a lot easier to successfully condense the notation. Scott's suggestion is a really good example of this, and I really like how the stems join with the different finger changes, and this way the rhythm of the changes is very, very clear. And I think the greatest challenge when approaching something like this is finding a compromise between how far things can be condensed or simplified, while at the same time keeping it as neat and organized as possible. One of my greatest concerns was to maintain the vertical relationships between the keys, so having the register key on top and then the other keys all the way down from there, which is something we can find in Scott's notation, and then finding a way to condense the notation while allowing enough space for simultaneous changes in keys that are really close together to be as neat and visible as possible. But I agree with Heather. I feel like simplifying things by getting rid of unnecessary information would definitely be the best place to start. And yeah, absolutely, I would really love to see which is your way that you would feel things would work best. I feel that for composers it's very easy to become fixated and obsessed with one specific way of working that we can see from the start, and it really takes someone else to reinterpret something differently or do something differently in order for us to realize that there are more effective or more efficient ways for us to get something done. So that would really be helpful. Also, with regards to articulation, I felt that the score was loaded enough of information. So in order for me to add any indications on articulation, I guess that the health lines throughout may indirectly hint towards the idea of slurring, which to me would feel quite intuitive in this context, but I feel that I think there's enough information, all the parameters for me to feel comfortable enough with the idea of giving room to the player for trying things out. Also, with regards to dynamics, the reason why I give specific dynamic markings to specific multiphonics has to do again with the way I was working in the conception of the piece. So all the different variations from the opening multiphonic were tested long distance with clarinettist Ben Pinto, and there were some instances of really interesting sounds that seemed to originate only at quite specific dynamic levels. So I wanted to kind of recreate this condition so that very similar or potentially similar sonic results could be obtained. I also took a similar approach with regards to rhythm, as some of the sounds or some of the resulting multiphonics seemed inherently less stable and need more time to accommodate than others. And I think that Scott's suggestion of letting the players know, even if it's in a really broad sense, where they are meant to focus their attention, what they're trying to achieve, or for how long they should try to keep the initial multiphonic-ish ringing is something really interesting, and I think it would really make things easier for the players, as at the moment the only indication of how disruptive a dynamic force should be relies only on if these dynamics are specific or less specific and more vague. So that could really be an interesting thing to explore. I think that in the end, as Scott said, this is part of a process and a big personal learning curve, and honestly, I feel far from a finished product. My attitude towards this was fairly experimental, and there are a few things I tried here for the very first time, and as Scott could guess, I'm still not sure what shape this will take or where this will end up, but I know that I definitely have a lot of interesting material and things to take from here. So thank you.
So it's really clear from watching your response video that you've thought about all of this stuff quite a lot. I had the feeling that nothing I said was really new for you. And I think, I mean, you used the word intuitive at one point, which I really liked, and that was sort of what was missing, was there was no way that I could play through it in an intuitive way. It's not possible to sight read a notation like this, and I guess the closer we can bring it to something that's sight readable, which it never really is going to be, because it's always going to be stretching the sort of logic of how I play the clarinet. But the closer you can bring it to that, the more time that there is to talk about music. So then we can talk about whether dynamics are kind of creating a musical line, or whether they're to help facilitate different kinds of sounds emerging. So the notation that Scott has showed you, that was sort of the idea that I had. We kind of, after he saw my video, he came up with that, and that's more or less exactly what I was thinking. So something that really links the fingering with the rhythm, that really helps already to make it a little bit closer. I really like the level of experimentation that you've gone to with this. I guess there's this sort of aspect of reinventing the wheel that happens when we try to do this, and I laughed when you said, composers have a tendency to fixate on it. Yeah, I'm very familiar with composers doing that, but yeah, I guess just to kind of, I think a lot of my job ends up being in those cases to just sort of like pull you back ever so slightly and say sort of a little bit of realism. But I want to see where it goes, because I think if the notation can be brought into this sort of intuitive space, then I think there's a lot of room, because there are a lot of great sounds that come out of this, and as especially with Ed's piece, it really does engage with some of the principles behind the project and how we're talking about multiphonics and stuff like this. So well done.
I had the problem I had in thinking about this piece was because the last time I used this notation, it was just basically one fingering, or it might change once or twice.
This presentation has been brought to you by the Royal Musical Association and my friend Binky the Squirrel.